Hey, did you know Mercedes developed the supercharger more than a century ago and called it a compressor? And the first turbocharged car had a tiny rocket fuel tank in it. And cruise control was developed by a blind man. Well, buckle up, these are some of the most interesting facts in automotive history. I'm Sven, this is Burnout, and it's called a... Did you know, until 1962, turbochargers could only be found on planes? Until Oldsmobile put it in its newest model, the Jetfire. First of all, the car looks crazy cool. And also it was crazy unreliable, as you can probably imagine. But the curious fact is, it needed a tiny rocket fuel tank, which was a mixture of distilled water and methanol, and it was sprayed into the manifold to cool down the intake charge. Now, as I already said, the first car with a supercharger was a Mercedes, all the way back in 1912. It was put in the Mercedes 625/40 horsepower, and now 6 was the model, and 2540 was the power increase, which is more than 60%. The way it worked is, under usual driving conditions, the engine and the supercharger weren't connected. But while you push the throttle, there was a little pedal on the right side, which you can push, maybe the first heel and toe, and the supercharger and the engine got connected to each other. Now, the engine was nothing special. It was a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder, which is actually smaller than this one, and that's a Miata. Oh, and by the way, for more cool facts, cool cars, and whatever else you're looking for, subscribe. Moving to some luxury items, and starting with the first automatic transmission, which was put in a 1940 Oldsmobile, which is actually the most recurring brand on this list. It was called a Hydromatic, and didn't know what smoothness means. And the first air conditioning was put in a Packard in 1940. It was called weather conditioning, so maybe not all names were better back then. And also it took up half of the trunk's car. And basically it could never be turned off because the drive belt was continuously connected to the compressor. So if the car was moving at all, cold air would enter the cabin. Now, the first board computer was put in a 1977 7 Series. It showed stuff like average fuel consumption, average speed, and distance traveled. What's interesting is this is the first vehicle which measured the average fuel consumption from the actual fuel injectors and not just from average speed. The first touchscreen in a car was put in the Buick Rapta in 1986. It was called the Graphic Control Center, and it displayed information like radio and climate control, as well as some trip information. Actually, Doug DeMuro has an interesting video about it, so if you want to know more, just go watch it there. After this video is over. The first navigation system was put in the 1981 Honda Accord. It was called the Electro Gyrocator, and it featured a little gyro which actually could determine when you turn, and there was a dot on the screen which followed your path. It cost more than $10,000 in today's money, which is more than 25% of the cost of the whole car, and it did actually work for a little bit, but the longer the trip went, the more inaccurate it got. And it did also work only in Japan. Now, the first actual GPS was put in the 1995 Oldsmobile 88. It cost about $4,500 in today's money, and it was called the GuideStar. It only worked in about 17 states in the US though. It also featured an audio, so those annoying trip notifications, they told back to the first GPS.
Start by driving northeast on Livingston Street.
Now, the first cruise control was put in the 1958 Chrysler Imperial, and it was actually developed by a blind man. The reason he came up with it is because he kept getting sick while his friends were driving him on the motorway. They were constantly pushing the brakes and then accelerating again and pushing the brakes and accelerating again. You know how sick you get while looking at your phone on the backseat of a car? I can imagine that being blind is worse. And imagine how bad his friends drove. Anyways, it gave us something cool. It was called the Speedostat, and it actually barely worked on uphills. And a few years later, Cadillac actually bought the patent and called it cruise control. Now, I didn't want to include any concept cars on this list, but this was way too interesting. The first self-driving car was the S-Class in 1995. This is the W140. The computer took up most of the back seats, but it actually worked pretty good. The car completed a 1,700-kilometer journey with the speeds up to 185 kilometers per hour, with lane changes, braking and accelerating as well. The first cup holder was put in the 1983 Dodge Caravan. I've got nothing else to say, but it I found it interesting. Automatic headlights were developed by GM and put in the Cadillac and Oldsmobile models in 1952. They turned on automatically at dusk, or in a tunnel, or in bad weather, and also the high beams could be shut on and off automatically depending on oncoming traffic or street lamps. Now, about the first standard seatbelts in a car. This is actually an interesting story. They were put in the 1959 Tucker 48, which was an American company developed by Mr. Tucker. I forgot his first name. Actually, when he developed the company, his whole agenda was safety. This was basically Volvo for the US. Now, the problem was that the big car companies didn't want cars to be seen as unsafe. So he kept getting pressure both politically and legally, and at the end, the company failed. The car looks amazingly cool, and there were about 50 examples made overall. And usually people say that the first actual seatbelts were in the Saab 750 GT or GT 750. Now, the first push to start, which is actually one of the most common luxury features today, was developed for the 1912 Cadillac Model 30. Now, actually, this was the first electric starter, but it didn't have an ignition key, it had just a button to start the car, so both things kind of came hand in hand. Now, the first actual key was developed by Chrysler in 1949, and it's not that cars didn't have any keys until that point, but they had different keys for the ignition, for the doors, for the trunk, and Cadillac was the first one who developed a key which actually looked just like mine. The first keyless entry was developed for the Nissan GTR R31, which, by the way, is the coolest looking GTR, and also the Marti is the coolest looking Supra. Speaking of the R31, it actually shares the first four-wheel steering with another car, the Honda Prelude. Both companies developed their own type of four-wheel steering, just months apart. About the R31, the four-wheel steering was electronical and it worked only in high-speed corners, while the Honda Prelude steering worked in both high-speed and low-speed corners, and it was also mechanical, no electronics at all. Speaking about drivetrain, the first car with four-wheel drive was the Spiker 60 horsepower in 1910, and it was actually the first car with a V6 and four-wheel brakes. The Spiker was a luxury Dutch company, but they developed the Spiker 60 horsepower specifically for uphill racing, and were the first one to use four-wheel drive there. So basically this was the Audi Quattro of the 1900s. And also, as I said, this was the first car to feature a 6-cylinder engine, while most other cars had between 1 and 4 cylinders. The first car with a V8 was the Cadillac Type 51 in 1915. Due to mass production, the price was actually relatively low, which helped Cadillac set the V8 as the hallmark of the USA until today. Now, the first car with a V12 was the Packard Twin 6 in 1916. Those were basically two V6s glued together, which brought immense smoothness to the vehicle compared to the other cars. And smoothness was actually what led to limousines using a V12 for the next 100 years. And now, for the last interesting facts, look at most of those cars that we spoke about today. There is something that is similar between all of them. Can you see what it is?
Excuse me. What are you selling?
Headlights, monsieur, headlights?
What the?
All of them have round headlights. And actually the first car to feature non-round headlights was the Renault Ami 6. Well, I'm Sven, this is Burnout, and if you like the video, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button because there is a lot more like this coming. Cheers!